Hello, everyone. Welcome back to season 7 of the Erasing Shame podcast. I'm Victoria Chang, your co host for Encouraging Christian Asian Mental Health. The goal of this season is to have authentic conversations with people who can share personally about their lived experiences, regardless if they're professionals or not. And today, my special guest is Marie Chan. In my mind, she will forever be Auntie Marie because when I was younger, we went to the same church. And when I was in fifth grade, she was my math teacher. A lot of time has passed since then. Marie, can you share a little bit about where you're currently residing and what you're up to?
Thank you so much, Victoria. It's such a joy to be here with you. I'm now in Orange County, California, so far from our days back in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I am a writer, and I have an upcoming picture book biography that's coming out called Mamie Takes A Stand, the true story of Mamie Tape, a Chinese American girl's fight for school rights. I'm also an adoptive mom, and I care a lot about adoptees. So I serve in the Initiative for Vulnerable Children at Saddleback Church as a connection support group leader, which is a trauma-informed support group for adoptive and foster parents. I also teach in our co-op as well. So yeah, I wear many hats.
Yeah, and you also have a giant bunny?
Yes. Yes, my bunny therapy, I call it. Yes. She's a 12-pound Flemish giant rabbit, and her name is Sunshine, that we adopted from the rescue, actually right before the COVID pandemic shut down. So she was a real joy to have through all of that. And yeah, we love her so much. And she does love books. She will let me know when I get a new book, she hears the rustling of those pages. And if I'm reading it aloud to my daughter in the other room, she lets me know, like, hey, I need to see that book too. And she's very persistent until I come over there and show her the pictures and read it aloud to her. So she's a reading rabbit.
That's so cute. I didn't even know rabbits could enjoy books. Wow, amazing.
She's a very good
Um,
listener.
yeah, I bet. I bet. Animals are honestly great listeners most of the time. Yeah. So I wanted to have Marie on this podcast to share about her book, which I got a chance to read early before its release. It's releasing September 3rd. So either you will be listening to this podcast and it is going to release, or it will have already released, and you'll be able to find it in the show notes, where we'll link all the access to her books and different resources about this book. Um, can you share about how you decided to write a children's book and what that journey has been like for you up until now?
Yeah, I mean, I originally loved using diverse picture books in my classroom. I really felt like it was important to affirm the cultural heritage of my students. However, I never thought of myself as being like the one that would write the books. It was usually curriculum or lesson plans. So this came about through just me reading aloud a story to my daughter. It was actually the start of the pandemic in 2020, and we couldn't go to our local library to browse the shelves to actually check out a physical like hardcover book. And my daughter just had access to like her school's like online library on her like iPad. And she just chose this book out of the blue. I don't know if it was because it was Women's History Month or something, and it was called Separate is Never Equal by Duncan Tonatia. And I thought, that's interesting phrase. Like that reminded me of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, that Supreme Court case that, outlawed segregation across the nation. But it was the protagonist, like the featured main character was a Latina girl. And it was reading all of these different names, city names where this case of Mendez et al. Versus Westminster et al. Made me think, wait, I recognize these cities. These are cities in California, close to where I grew up. I mean, my family used to dine on like dim sum at this one Chinese seafood restaurant that was literally like on the same street a mile away from where the Mendez case took place. And we passed by that all the time as when I was a child, and I never knew that there were separate Mexican schools and segregated schools in California. I thought it was something that only occurred, in the deep South and, just wasn't something in California. So I just went on this rabbit trail of research about school segregation in California. I was very curious because when I had taught in Los Angeles, my student population was mostly families who had immigrated from Mexico. And I was like, how come I didn't know about this person, Sylvia Mendez, and all the other families involved in this case? And so through that research, then it became even more personal, and I discovered Mamie Tape and the Tape v. Hurley case. And I was like, wait a second, now this is an even broader problem that I didn't know that Chinese Americans. So Mamie Tape stories in 1884, she was denied entrance into her local San Francisco public school, which was literally like a tenth of a mile from her home. That she was not allowed to go because her parents were immigrants from China, even though she was born in the United States. And so her case was fought all the way up to the California Supreme Court. And so that is why I decided, hey, there's no picture book biography yet about her. Let's make this accessible to families, especially busy families who don't have time to read large tomes of tomes of research. Let's make it so that they could read this in like 15, 20 minutes to their child at bedtime and have those conversations about race and broaden their perspective.
Yeah. I was reading this book and I'm not a kid, and I'm not a parent, but as a young adult, I was learning a lot about Mamie's family, the boldness of her mother, to advocate for Mamie. And I was like, wow, I didn't even know that Chinese American or Chinese immigrant kids had this struggle. I learned about Ruby Bridges, but I didn't even know about Sylvia Mendez. I didn't know about Mamie Tape. And I'm guessing that all across the United States, there have been probably similar issues with people of color, immigrants, all the way back, that we're just not taught about because there's so much to teach about, but also um, honestly, I don't think educators or people who are writing about the curriculum necessarily want to share a darker past where not everyone was able to go to school. I'm not sure. That's just my speculation. But when I was growing up, I only learned briefly about the Chinese Exclusion Act and Asian history in America for the maybe less than 5% of my whole education from like kindergarten all the way up until high school. And then when you go to college, you have to take certain classes if you want to learn about the Korean War or other specific parts of history. So I think this book is so accessible um, for people of all ages. And I'm really thankful that I got a chance to read it early and I have a copy. The illustrations are so beautiful. Um, I was wondering in the process of writing this, were there moments where you took in all this information and then had a hard time like whittling it down into a picture book? Or did you feel like that was the right format? Did you ever feel like you wanted to switch to maybe a larger book?
Yeah, I mean, I knew I wanted to do it in a picture book format, but I knew this was a very complicated case because you have things going on in court, but then you also have things going on in the state assembly and legislation, and then you have also federal issues and like constitutional law. So there's just a lot of layers and complexities, and how do you pare that down within a very short amount of space, but also making so it doesn't sound like an encyclopedia entry. I
Yeah.
wanted it to read like a story. I wanted for readers to feel empathy and to really walk in Mamie's shoes, and for children to see themselves reflected in the pages of this book. And so I intentionally put metaphors and different literary devices, and I did plot out like a story arc to really keep it cohesive, and so it would read like a narrative and not just like an encyclopedia. But there were times I'm like, oh, should this be more like a graphic novel? Because a graphic novel's thicker.
Hmm.
Um, but I think in the end I was like, no, picture book. I'm not that good at writing graphic novels yet, so let me just
Not
stick with
yet.
picture book. Um, but I'm thankful that my editor, who's Asian American, he was very good at understanding the cultural nuances of Chinese culture and the intentionality of keeping certain Chinese phrases in the book and not omitting them. And so he was okay with it being slightly longer than a normal picture book and having it geared more towards middle grade readers. So I think like that's the balance that we found in the length.
Yeah, I enjoyed it and I'm excited to share it with potentially some students that I teach, other friends as well. I think picture books are for adults too. They're not just for kids. And it's so accessible, right? Like, not everyone wants to do a rabbit hole of learning and compiling things by themselves and reading research papers or like encyclopedia entries. So this is perfect. Um, you mentioned in a conversation that we had earlier that sometimes uh, it might be exhausting as an author to be doing all of this research. Um, you did a lot of research on this book. And how did you take care of yourself and your mental and physical while writing this book?
Yeah, I think something that is not talked a lot about in the writing community, especially the impact on BIPOC writers, is when we have to write about some tough topics like racial discrimination, that it can be almost like feeling like you're going through secondary trauma because you're parsing through a lot of articles, primary sources where there's a lot of, unfortunately, hate speech, a lot of propaganda, things that were written that are really hard to read. And you have to read them over and over again when you're doing the research, but you're also immersing yourself, right? Because you're trying to draw out that emotion, feel what the character felt. And so in some ways, you are kind of feeling those same things. I think what was particularly difficult is that when I started the research in 2020, there was there were many high incidents of anti-Asian hate. And it was very ironic, or it just felt really difficult that I was reading all the blaming and scapegoating of Chinese in the late 1800s during Mamie Tape's time period and in the era of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. But at the same time, in 2020, I was seeing history repeating itself. And that was hard. Like seeing newspaper articles from 2020 being so similar to things, some of the same slurs being used again in attacks. And I was just like heartbroken. It was very hard. And so I think as a writer, if you are writing tough topics, I think it's okay to let yourself have some of those moments of respite. I know it can seem hard sometimes when you're on deadline, but I think it's important to, like you said, to have that soul care, self care, to just step back, um, but also to have a writing community. So There were some other writers of color that I was able to share some of my struggles with, and I'm really thankful for that support because they understood what I was, talking about. Like it can be very difficult. So to have that community that you can go to is really important. And just be kind to yourself that it's okay um, to take breaks and take care. Yeah, like all of that's integrated, like your physical, mental, emotional health, and take walks, take breaks, feel
Snuggle
like
with your giant bunny.
snuggle with my bunny, a bunny therapy. Yeah.
Um, you also mentioned earlier, this is the second time we're actually recording this because the first time I had technical issues where it didn't upload to the cloud. But in our first conversation, you talked about how you were able to work with a historian slash someone who was able to like show you the primary sources of the Tape family, um, and then you were able to get in touch with maybe the Tape family's relative. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think it really takes a village to make a book. I mean, my name's on the cover, but actually there were just so many different people. And I think that that's where I really encourage people to explore their histories, but also the elderly are like a wealth of information. And that was the joy of like interviewing all these different people. Yes, there was a professor, Asian American professor, Dr. May Nai. Some of you guys might be familiar with her work. She was interviewed by PBS for the Asian Americans series that they had a few years ago. But she is a very um, good researcher, and she spent a lot of time researching the Tate family. So it was very kind of her to give me access to a digitized recording of Mamie Tape being interviewed about the Tate Hurley case in when she was in her late 90s, I believe. Yeah, she lived a long time. So this recording is from like the 1970s. And that was really helpful because it let me hear Mamie's voice, that she had courage and confidence, but she was also very kind and compassionate, and that she didn't have a lot of bitterness about the case. But she knew, like, what was right and wrong. But I mean, it was just so nice to hear her voice and hear her talk about her life. But there were other historians, people who had studied the architecture of the area, who had helped me. And especially one thing I did want to highlight that took me actually a lot of time. Like I spent weeks like researching just like one letter, like in the transliteration of one of these Chinese characters in the book. And because there were some discrepancies. And so I actually reached out to a professor who specializes in Chinese heritage languages, like the dialects, to figure out like the Hoisanhua, Toisanese, Cantonese, Mandarin. It's very complex, and people will probably just read the pronunciation in the back matter and just not think twice about it, but actually took me a lot of research to compile that and try to find what was the closest transliteration. Because I really wanted to emphasize some of these minority dialects. I think it's important. It has some kind of a heart language, um, because Mandarin is great, that's like, but that's the most well known. But that's actually a lot of other heritage languages, dialects, and so I wanted to show that there was diversity there, even within the Chinese language, just from my own experience, because my parents also speak Taiwanese and Hakka. And so, yeah, I thought that would be interesting to note.
Yeah. Um, I have the book with me, and can
Oh,
I show the
yay.
cover? Is that allowed?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm not sure like what you can
Yeah, go ahead.
show and what you can't show before release. But
And I'm
here's
glad
the
you have it
book.
because, like, I forgot to
Yeah.
put it next to me. So,
Well, I have the
hey.
book right here. It's so beautiful. I I guess people who are watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see what I'm holding up, but essentially it's the cover of Mamie Takes a Stand, a Chinese American girl's fight for school rights. The illustrations and the book design itself makes it very readable. And um, I wanted to ask you, what is your hope for this book in being released? I know you mentioned like you want the history to be accessible to parents and young, learners, and like middle grade learners as well. But like as you were writing this story, is there like a personal motivation that you have in releasing this to the world?
Well, as a child growing up, I did not see myself reflected on the shelves of my school library or public library. And even now, if you go to the biography section, there are not that many stories of Asian Americans. I think there's more, and there's more anthologies being written, which I'm so glad to see. Um, but still not quite as many as I think we'd like. So I think when you said in our other conversation, Victoria, that you saw yourself reflected and you could connect to Mamie's story, I was like, yay, yes, that was one of my
Mission
goals.
accomplished.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, that was just like, that was just so heartwarming to hear you say that because I was like, I want children to feel like they're seen and that
Mm,
their cultural heritage is valued. And um, but not just for the kids that are, Asian, but really for kids to also broaden their perspectives, right? And of the world. And so I think it's really important to show, um, to value and show diversity, but also to have unity and solidarity. And so towards the end of the book, there is a portrait of Sylvia Mendez, Ruby Bridges, Linda Brown, and Mamie Tape. And I really wanted to show like these cases built on each other. They're very interconnected and interwoven in some ways, and that we really need to be united as well. We can celebrate our uniqueness, but then also be united um, in standing up against injustice. And I wanted kids to really be able to grow in empathy and respect. I think that's how we'll have a more just and compassionate world. I love, how there's been organizations that have been collecting a lot of data and providing a lot of statistics about uh, different issues concerning Asian Americans, especially during that time of anti Asian hate. There was a lot of statistics that were being compiled and reporting of incidents. And I think that's very important. But I think there's something about story, one person's story that really builds empathy that you can connect with. And so I wanted to show that. I also wanted to show allyship. If you saw my story, I was very intentional in showing that as well. I wanted to show a balance too. That way, if there are bystanders, what can you do with the gifts and the areas of influence you have in your community? So I wanted to also show that there is a place for everyone to be part of the solution.
yeah, there's a great portion at the back of the book that has like discussion questions, I think, for
Yes.
people to talk about with whether you're reading it to your kid or just even for me to reflect on as a reader, um, that can foster those kinds of like ponderings and conversations. Um, And then there's also a glossary that can lead to more learning about um, this topic. And you said that you were so happy when I mentioned that I saw myself in this book, and I'm glad because like it really is special to have books that I own on my shelf for me and for my future kids that like are not only uh, historically accurate and informative, but also just represent like what we look like, what we eat, even. I mentioned that one of my favorite portions of this book revolves around the food. Even though that's not a huge portion of the book, but when I saw that page, there's like a spread. And then on one side, it talks about how the Tape family would get food from the locals. And so like they would have bok choy brought to their home. And then some of Mamie's favorite foods were like chow mein and corn. And um, in my bio for Erasing Shame, I wrote about how I grew up from a mix of food. So like I am from like red bean buns at the local Chinese grocery store, but at the same time I love mac and cheese and hot dogs. Because I grew up like low income and that was like our great like yummy food. And so it's just interesting to have a mix of that. And then I see that in this book and I'm like, wow, I relate, even though this is from like the 1800s, I think I'm second or third gen, as a third gen Chinese American, to still be able to relate to Mamie from, hundreds of years ago is very interesting. So I am super excited for people to get their hands on this book. Can you tell us where? Oh, sorry, you want to say something?
I was just going to say something about so there I did write a pretty extensive parent and educator guide that accompanies the book, and I did talk to Mamie Tape's great granddaughter to talk about
Mm-hmm.
how their family, the Tape family, cooked chow mein. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
recipe in that guide
Mm-hmm.
that talks about that. So I love how you could connect with that. And one other thing I did want to mention is, as you were talking, one of the other goals of my book was really identity
Mm.
formation. I think about myself, how I felt a lot of shame being Chinese American growing up, and just kind of wanting to mute that part of my identity. And I really want people to be able to celebrate like the unique way that God made them. And so I think
Mm.
there's something about uh, being made in the image of God that really spoke to me also. And I want to mention, so in the book, there is an excerpt from Mrs. Tape's letter to the school board about their mistreatment of Mamie. And those words really resonated with me especially when I was first researching the book. And they still resonate today, but she said, "Is it a disgrace to be born a Chinese? Didn't God make us all? What right have you to bar my child out of the public schools because she is a Chinese descent?" And I think sometimes as Asians, we feel that disgrace. And yet she's right. Like her question, didn't God make us all? No, yeah, that what they were doing was not biblical. Like God made us all and in our very unique way. And that's something that I want kids to know. Like that's something to celebrate. We want to affirm that Imago Day in you. Like it's a beautiful thing, not
Mm.
something to be ashamed of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that letter from Mamie's mom, Mrs. Tape, also stuck out to me, especially the phrase like, didn't God make us all? And she's talking to, this was published in the newspaper, right, at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yes.
the people who are reading it, a lot of them were probably practicing Christians, right? And so they go to church, and I'm sure they're religious, but to, have someone remind you like of the Imago Dei and everyone, um, is very bold for her as a minority woman of color, to say that to the public newspaper. I mean, to everyone who's reading it, because the newspaper was the main form of media at the time.
Yeah, and one struggle I had in the publishing of this book was whether or not to keep Mamie's mother's non-standard English. And I
Mm.
decided to print it exactly the way she wrote it.
Hmm.
Um, Even with the misunderstanding that people might think, oh, Marie, you had some grammatical or spelling errors in your manuscript. Because I think about the times for me as a child, because I was more fluent in speaking English than my parents, where I have to translate or advocate for them. Um, and I wanted to say, you know what? Even if you don't speak impeccable English or write perfect English,
Hmm.
and you're an immigrant,
Hmm.
if you see injustice, stand up and make your voice known, and it's okay. And so I wanted to affirm that and say, encourage people to do that and not be timid about about standing up against injustice. So I decided to leave it just as it is, and people can check the, source notes and look up the primary source themselves and see it. But that was an intentional decision to not
Yeah.
check that.
I like that decision a lot. I feel like that's very true to probably just the whole story of what actually happened. It's very authentic. So I'm going to close out this episode. But before we say bye, Marie, could you let us know where we can find your book and the educator's copy and anything else you'd like to share?
So you can go to my website, mariechan.com. And then if you go to mariechan.com/books, it will have the links to all the different retailers that carry my book. And also, there will be a link there soon for you to download the educator guide. It has a lot of multisensory, cross-cultural, cross-curricular, engaging activities. And I hope you'll take a look at that. Victoria, just one real quick tidbit I just want to say is that there were a lot of photographs that Mrs. Tape took, because she was a photographer, that I couldn't include in the actual book. And the reason why it's important that I included it in the educator guide, where there's an activity to analyze these primary sources and artifacts, is that it matters a lot who takes the pictures. So we talk a lot about in Asian American history how a lot of Asians were photographed in a way that made them look exotic, that continues that feeling of being a perpetual foreigner. And Mrs. Tape, interestingly, she took photographs in Chinatown, and there's pictures of Mamie and her sisters that actually kind of combat that stereotype. Even though it's the same time period, and you can compare these photographs to other well-known photographers that aren't people of color. And her photographs show examples of integration. So in that educator guide, there's a photograph of Mamie's youngest sister with an African-American neighbor. And so other things like that are very interesting. Yeah, and this is the late 1800s. So I hope people will access the educator guide and use these primary sources to continue to have conversations.
Yeah, I want that educator's guide, especially also knowing that you said the chow mein recipe is in there. I want to try it.
Yes. Yeah, I'm so thankful for the Tape family descendants that graciously gave me access to so many historic family photographs and interviews and just stories about their family. So that was a real blessing, and I'm happy that they're allowing me to share that with you guys in the educator guide, and hope it will be helpful.
So guys, please look at the website, find this book, share it with people that you know, and also review it on the sites that you can find it at. I'll be writing a review too. And thank you so much, Auntie Marie, for joining me, for recording this twice through technological difficulties. And I hope to visit you in California soon.
Yes.
If not by the end of this year, next year for sure. So,
yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much, Victoria. It was such a joy to see you again.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Erasing Shame podcast. Get this episode's show notes at our website, erasingshame.com. Subscribe to the Erasing Shame podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or any podcast app. And please add a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our message of hope and healing.